We're going to look at two songs by Charles Ives. So we've been looking at American music that's more recent, and now we're going to go back in time a bit and look at an experimental American composer from the very early part of the 20th century. So Charles Ives grew up in New England, and his father was a band leader from the Civil War. So he grew up with music in the home, and he decided that even though he had an interest in music, that what he really wanted to do was not be poor. So he had a career as a life insurance salesman and kept track of life insurance policies and things like that. So as a hobby, he would write his music, and he used his own money that he made doing in the insurance business to be able to publish his music. Now, one of the things that Ives wrote is he wrote a very large collection of songs, and a couple of things that I'm going to point out to you. He did experimental music with things like polytonality, polyrhythm, tone clusters, aleatory elements, and quarter tones. So we've already been looking at composers that did things like this, right? Stravinsky and Bartók like to use polytonality and polyrhythms, polymeter, that kind of thing. A tone cluster is when instead of playing a chord, you play a whole bunch of notes right all next to each other, and it just sounds like a banging sound, because there's no harmony. It's all just like half steps and whole steps together. Quarter tones. That's when you decide you're going to use pitches that are in between the sharps and flats, right? Not just half steps, but quarter steps. And of course, we've already talked about the use of aleatory elements. So he does those kinds of things as well. Let's start by looking at his song, The Cage. This is on 205. So this song is not very long, and you'll listen to it, and I want you to listen to it first and think about, as you're listening to it, think about harmony. What scale is the composer using? Are there any aleatory elements? Are there any sort of non-traditional elements? So go ahead, before we finish this video, please go ahead and listen to the piece and see if you can answer those questions. Harmony, meter, rhythm, use of scale, non-traditional aspects, any aleatory aspects. See if you can get some of that figured out. And then after you work on that, then come back. All right, you're back. How's that? So let's talk a little bit. You'll notice that this text very much fits the melody and vice versa. A leopard went around his cage from one side back to the other, and the melody just sort of goes back up and down. It sort of wanders aimlessly. The melody doesn't feel very goal-oriented, just like the leopard is not goal-oriented wandering around in the cage. And he uses a lot of whole tone. The whole tone scale, now he doesn't stay on just one whole tone scale, he kind of switches around. But the use of the whole tone scale does give it that sort of wandering, aimless, not goal-oriented quality to the music. Let's take a look at the harmonies. You'll notice that the harmonies are stacked in fourths. So you have that more sort of open, big sound. Sometimes we call that quartal harmony, harmonies in fourths. One of the things about harmonies in fourths is it doesn't have the richness that we associate when we stack harmonies in thirds. It also doesn't fit the whole tone scale. The whole tone scale and these harmonies in fourths do not go together. They're very much like sort of juxtaposed. And I think that does a good job of suggesting that maybe these harmonies sort of represent the iron bars of the cage, right? There's sort of these locked in, sort of unyielding harmonies. And then we've got the whole tone kind of up and down meandering, like trapped in these bars. So the use of the chordal, the harmony stacked in fourths and the whole tone, especially considering that this piece was written in 1906. So, that's long before composers like Stravinsky were doing these kinds of experimental things with their music. So he was very much sort of ahead of his time in this kind of thing. You'll notice that it says at the beginning, repeat 2 or 3 times. So that's already an aleatory feature about this music, right? How much drama do you need building up before you finally get to the singer coming in? You probably also notice that there is not a traditional meter. We have, just 1 or 2 bar lines really. There's 1 bar line here. And then, look at this thing. That chord is enormous. Ives likes to do that. He likes to write, just crazy big chords that like a pianist is going to have to grow 2 more arms to be able to play. He really pushes the absolute limit of what's possible with trying to just use 10 fingers. So let's take a look at another piece by Ives on 206. This is a longer song. General William Booth Enters into Heaven. So a couple of things is General William Booth is not John Wilkes Booth. So let's just be clear on who General William Booth is. So General William Booth is an English preacher who started the Salvation Army. When he started it, the idea of the Salvation Army was that it sort of had like a pseudo-military kind of command structure, right? He was the general of the entire Salvation Army, right? And then probably there were colonels, and maybe Colonel A, he was in charge of, California Salvation Armies, and Colonel B was in charge of Texas or whatever. And then you would have your majors, right? Majors in charge of Los Angeles, and then each major had a captain in charge of their division or whatever. So that was the idea of him being a general, was he was just in charge of the Salvation Army, and it had a top-down command structure. Now, a couple of things is whenever there were parades, and parades is like a big thing in the history of our country. 4th of July, especially parades in New England. That would have been a thing, right? That you would have people would come through and you'd have a band playing, and one of those bands would be the Salvation Army band, right? And they would be beating the drums and playing the music. And that's one of the things that Ives is trying to bring out in his piece, is the idea of sort of that kind of marching band music that he grew up with, because his father was a band leader. At the beginning, some of these chords are supposed to probably sound like drum cadences, da-dum, 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 that kind of thing. I'm going to tell you a few other things. Ives has sort of hidden secret music that he brings in to his songs. I'm going to play you one of the songs that's hidden in this song. Some of you might recognize that as a church hymn called the Cleansing Fountain. And one of the things that Ives does is he takes that music that he grew up with, right? He, going to a Protestant church on Sunday mornings and hearing this music and things like that. Like that was sort of in his head. That was one of his the sources of his upbringing. And so you're going to hear some of that music in here. Now, I do have some things that I'd like you to listen for and look at as you're going through this piece. So, other musical sources. Are there other hymns? Are there other popular songs? And when I say pop songs, I mean like a song like Camptown Races or Yankee Doodle, right? Those are the kinds of things that people would have known back then. Are there any examples of polytonality or other experimental harmony in this piece? What about meter? Does Ives use a traditional rhythm and meter, or are there places where it's more experimental? This is a song. What about word painting? Are there places where Ives uses something in the music to reflect what's going on in the text? For example, if the composer sighed, if it says and then he sighed, if the music went and had a sigh in it, right? That kind of thing. Or remember when we looked at Earl King and it does games to play or whatever, right? He uses the little melisma to make it sound like a game or like playing. So lots and lots of things. Any other experimental or non-traditional things? So anyway, go ahead and take a listen. And after you've listened, so go ahead and pause this video, pause it, and then make sure you've listened to this song. It's a trip, and then let's come back and let's talk about a few things. So a couple of things is you'll notice there's a lot of dissonance. Like here he's got a chord with D, F sharp, A sharp, B natural, C natural, and then he has A natural down here. You can see how this and this are not going to, there's a lot of dissonance throughout. It starts with a pretty standard rhythm. Moves led boldly with his big bass drum. And then here we have the quotation from the Cleansing Fountain. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Right. And so we get a lot of that dissonance. Get a couple of little meter changes in here. Look at 207. Holy moly. What do we have here? Tone clusters. Right? He's not stacking his harmonies in thirds or fourths. He's just playing clusters of tones up. So we're going to get a really raucous effect. And again, you'll see more and more really large dissonant chords. I mean, it's almost impossible to figure out what this is. He was clearly just going for a large noise because we've got all naturals and then we've got flats up there and sharps. Here we get some word painting. Booth had groaned for more. And look at the groaning. Booth had groaned for more, right? We've got that glissando. And some other things to point out. Here we have an old-timey song. I'm trying to remember what that song is. Is that from "Oh Dem Golden Slippers"? I think it might be the chorus from the old timey song "Oh Dem Golden Slippers." Check out this time signature. 4.5 over 4. So clearly Bartok, if he had done this, he would have notated it as a 9/8 with those like slashy bar lines. Because here we have 2/8, 1/8, so 1. It looks like 2/8, 2/8, and then 3/8. So 2 plus 2 plus 3 plus 2. So it's sort of a 9/8, but it's an asymmetrical 9/8, and he called it 4.5 over 4. And of course, again, here we are on page 209. Very, very, very thick, very active textures. Just, there's so much going on. Here he threw in like a little 1/8 bar to give it a quick hiccup. Something Stravinsky would later do in things like Rite of Spring. Let's see. We get some word painting here with trumpets blowed a blare. Trumpets blowed a blare. Trumpets blowed a blare. Right, that sounds like the trumpet doing reveille. Bum ba da dum bum bum ba da dum bum. So the singer's actually making the trumpet sound with the notes. If we look on page 210, we'll see again just a massive wash of sound of naturals and flats. And finally, we get a tender moment at measure 82. So all of the sinners, of course, are going by in this crazy parade, to heaven, with General Booth leading them, leading all the sinners. And suddenly we have this moment where Jesus comes out and stretches his hands. And then, of course, we get more word painting. Round and 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 right. So this sort of round and round goes round and round in the music, and then it ends with sort of this sort of fade out of the parade. And again, another Ives trick. We saw this in the cage. Super duper big chords where the pianist is going to have to figure out how to play all those notes. Here's another thing. He wanted all of this and all of this played at the same time, but he couldn't figure out how to notate it. So he did a double stemmy thing. And so that way, but otherwise this is all supposed to be the same chord. So again, these huge polytonal harmonies with these crazy textures. Well, I really do hope you liked in General William Booth Enters into Heaven, because I always think it's just an absolute kick. I have included a sort of an orchestra version of it as well as the piano version, so you can listen and kind of compare. I really like Thomas Hampson singing the orchestra version. I think that this is probably going to be my last video. because I really want you to be able to work on your project and go through this material for your exam. I'll do a video just to tell you to prep you for the exam, but otherwise we're wrapping up.